Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the hallways of Mercy General, as if the title settled everything, as if the woman moving through the trauma bay at 11:51 p.m. with her hand steady as surgical steel was anything less than lethal. Dr. Victor Hargrove didn't know. Not yet. He saw faded scrubs and a trauma nurse with unremarkable competence, someone who kept her head down, clocked her 12 hours, and disappeared into the Raleigh night like she had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. He didn't see the scars on her knuckles that formed constellations, white and raised and beautiful in the way that only damage can be. He didn't see the way she positioned herself with her back to walls, scanning the exits with the precise geometry of someone who'd learned that survival was mathematics. And he absolutely did not see the faded Coast Guard Maritime Security Response Team patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the thread worn smooth from 20 years of being touched like a talisman, like a prayer to a God that had already forgiven her for things his mind couldn't contain. Natalie Hayes moved through the fluorescent corridors of the trauma ward with a kind of deliberate unremarkability that only came from training. Not nursing school training, the other kind. The kind that taught you how to disappear in plain sight, how to be essential without being visible, how to save lives while leaving no footprint. The antiseptic smell mixed with floor wax and something underneath it, something copper and ancient, the ghost of 100 codes and 1,000 transfusions. At 11:52 p.m., she approached room 347 with a fresh fur bag, her badge hanging from a lanyard that had faded from navy to grey. The badge read N. Hayes, RN, Trauma. Not the rank she'd earned. Not the name she'd once worn like armor across 3 continents. Just enough to let her work. Just enough to let her fade. Commander James Riley lay in the post-surgery bed like a man who'd spent his life in places where the rules rewrote themselves. Chest tubes in place. Thoracic surgery completed 12 hours prior. Routine. Stable. The kind of patient who made a nurse's shift manageable. His color was good. Oxygen saturation 96%. Heart rate 68, strong and regular like a diesel engine idling in a garage. Natalie checked the monitor without looking at his face, without letting her hands linger on the foresight any longer than clinical necessity required. But his eyes tracked her movement, and when she finally looked down to adjust the drip rate, something in his expression shifted. Recognition. The kind that belonged to someone who'd seen you before, a long time ago, under circumstances that both of you were supposed to forget. Her hands trembled. Not from nervousness, from muscle memory. 20 years of suppressed muscle memory, the kind that lived in your tendons and nerves and bones, waiting for the right trigger to wake up and remember what her body had been trained to do. She steadied the 4 with a motion so small it looked like nothing, a correction, a professional adjustment. Her jaw clenched once. That was all. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, classified out of existence since 2003, checked his vitals and wrote them in the chart with a handwriting so controlled it looked mechanical. Blood pressure 120/80. Pulse 68. Respirations 14. All normal. All safe. All a lie? How long since the surgery? His voice carried the weight of command authority, the kind that didn't need to be loud to move through a room. 12 hours, Commander. She didn't stumble over the rank. Mercy General had enough military contractors and retired service members that a Coast Guard officer recovering from elective surgery wasn't unusual. Dr. Hargrove closed at 11:30 this morning. Your chest tubes are patent. No drainage concerns. Pain level. 3 out of 10. Manageable. He watched her face like a man who'd been trained to read people the way she'd been trained to disappear. You've done this before. Thoracic recovery protocols are fairly standard across most trauma centers, Commander. Your textbook post-op. She moved toward the door, the conversation closing like a hatch. Professional. Bounded. Safe. Your name. She stopped. One hand on the door frame. One breath held in her chest like a classified document. Natalie Hayes, she said without turning around. Not Senior Chief. Not the name that had lived in redacted files and black ink documents for 2 decades. Just Natalie. Just the nurse that Mercy General could afford to employ. "Call the desk if you need anything. I'll be back in 30 minutes to check your lines." She left before he could say another word, before muscle memory could take over her voice and her posture and everything she'd buried so carefully beneath scrubs and exhaustion. Back at the nurse's station, her hands moved through the motions of charting with the precision of someone running a weapons check, each keystroke deliberate, each entry a way to keep her mind from thinking about what she'd seen in his eyes. Recognition. History. The possibility that the past had decided it wasn't finished with her yet. The trauma bay was controlled chaos at this hour, the way emergency departments learn to live at midnight. 2 paramedics rolled past with a vehicle accident victim, wheels squeaking on linoleum like a sound that belonged to the hospital's heartbeat. The monitor showed 2:34 a.m. on the clock above the main desk. Natalie had been working for 14 hours. 2 more on her shift. Then nothing until tomorrow night. Then the same routine again, invisible and competent and utterly unremarkable. She'd built a life on that formula. 12 hours of work. 12 hours of nothing. Rinse. Repeat. Let nobody see what you were. Let nobody know what you'd done. Dr. Victor Hargrove stood at the nurse's station watching the monitor feeds, his surgical cap still in place though his surgery had ended hours ago. He wore the confidence of a man whose family had built hospitals like other families built houses, whose name was on a wing, whose protocols weren't suggestions, they were doctrine. He was 48 years old and had never been questioned by anyone with authority, which meant he'd never developed the muscle memory for losing. His jaw was sharp. His hands were clean. His eyes were the pale blue of someone who'd never seen anything that broke him. He watched Natalie work. She was moving through the post-operative assessments with a methodical grace that made her look like she was dancing to music only she could hear. No wasted motion. No hesitation. She read a monitor and made clinical decisions without consulting the chart. She adjusted medication levels without checking the medication list. She made calls on oxygen therapy and fluid balance with the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who'd done this thousands of times, who'd learned it not in a classroom but in a place where mistakes cost lives in minutes, not hours. A third-year resident named Morris was standing at the foot of a trauma bay with a patient whose oxygen saturation had dipped to 92%, still safe but trending wrong. Morris was young enough that he still consulted protocols before making moves, which meant he was standing there reading his phone instead of reading his patient. Natalie glanced over. She didn't interrupt. She didn't approach. She just said, quiet enough that only Morris heard it, check his positioning. Left side compression might be occluding the right main stem. Tap the percussion. Morris looked up like someone had spoken to him from behind a glass wall. He tapped the patient's right chest wall with his fingers. Percussion, the oldest diagnostic tool in medicine, the thing they taught you in year 1 and then stopped using because Dr. Hargrove preferred imaging. The sound changed. Dull on the right where it should have been resonant. Pneumothorax. Small. Developing. Exactly the kind of thing that killed you if you waited for imaging to catch it. He needs a chest tube, Natalie said, already moving toward the bay with a trauma tray. Size 32 French. Anterolateral thoracotomy approach, 5th intercostal space. I'll assist. Morris stood there for 1 second like someone waking up from a long sleep, and then he moved, and within 6 minutes the tube was in place and the saturation was climbing back to 96, and the patient stopped looking like someone dying and started looking like someone who'd just been saved. Nobody had called Dr. Hargrove. Nobody had requested authorization. Natalie had read the situation and made the decision, and Morris had trusted her judgment enough to act on it, and the patient was alive because of that chain of trust. Dr. Hargrove watched the entire thing from the central station. His face didn't change. The pale blue eyes didn't even blink. But something inside him tightened the way muscles tighten before they explode, a gathering of pressure that had nowhere to go except outward. He stood and walked to the nurse's station, his white coat moving like it was made of money and authority instead of cotton and thread. At the central monitor, he pulled up the orders for that patient, looking for the authorization code that should have been his. There wasn't one. Natalie had made the call, and the patient had survived it, and nobody had needed to ask permission. That was the thing that made him want to break something. Not that she'd been right. He could have forgiven her if she'd been right and apologetic about it. What he couldn't forgive was that she'd been right and unsurprised by that fact. That she'd moved through the decision like someone who'd made 1,000 decisions exactly like it, who'd trained somewhere that taught you that your hands were more important than hierarchy, that your clinical judgment mattered more than your title. He walked past the nurse's station where Natalie was documenting the tube placement with the same controlled precision she brought to everything. She was typing with 2 hands, her back straight, her shoulders set like a soldier at rest. She didn't acknowledge his approach. That was part of what made him want to push her, the way she simply wouldn't acknowledge him when he was trying to make a point about authority and procedure and the way things were supposed to work in an institution that he'd been promised would always respect his name. Ms. Hayes. Not Natalie. Not a question. A summons. She turned. Her eyes were the color of calm, which was somehow worse than anger. Anger he could work with. Anger made mistakes. Calm just waited. Yes, Dr. Hargrove. That patient was assigned to Morris. You don't make clinical decisions on residents' patients without consultation. The patient's oxygen saturation was declining. Morris was reviewing protocol instead of assessing. I provided a clinical suggestion. He executed the procedure. That's not how this works. His voice dropped, the way power made voices drop, the acoustic equivalent of moving closer without actually moving. You're trauma nursing staff. You assist. You don't lead. You don't educate the residents. You certainly don't make decisions about interventions without running them through the chain of command first. Natalie set down her pen. The motion was so controlled it looked like she was defusing a bomb. Her hands came to rest on the edge of the desk, and he could see the scars on her knuckles, white and raised and patterned like something intentional. The patient needed intervention. The intervention worked. The patient will be discharged in 4 days with full pulmonary function. She was speaking in the tone of someone reading from a manual, every word chosen for maximum professional distance. I provided clinical support. That's within my scope as a trauma nurse. That's not clinical support. That's insubordination. And there it was, the word he'd been waiting to use. The justification that would let him begin the process of making her understand that Mercy General wasn't a place where people operated outside his authority. You don't question residents. You don't advise them. You don't make interventions without approval. I need that to be very clear. She turned back to her documentation without responding, which was somehow a response in itself. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she typed, and the moment passed like a stone sinking through dark water, leaving nothing but ripples. Dr. Hargrove stood there for another moment, waiting for something, an apology, a defense, some crack in her composure that would let him know he'd been heard. None of it came. She simply worked, methodical and unremarkable and completely immune to his authority in a way that made him want to find a way to prove that she wasn't. That nobody was. That everyone answered to something, and that something, in his hospital, was him. He left the nurse's station and returned to his office, his mind already turning like machinery, like a system that had been designed to protect itself and was now calibrating its defenses. By morning, he would begin making calls. He would invoke his relationships with board members. He would start documenting her infractions with the precision of someone building a case. But that night, he simply sat in his office and thought about the way she'd looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that came from someone who'd already survived worse, who'd been broken and remade by something bigger than a hospital or a hierarchy or a man who believed his own importance was a law of physics. And that was the thing he couldn't accept, the possibility that somewhere in her past, in that quiet, unremarkable body, lived something that had nothing to do with him at all. The cafeteria at Mercy General smelled like industrial beef broth and something else, the acrid sting of professional humiliation. Dr. Hargrove stood near the salad station during lunch rush, his voice carrying across 3 tables of residents like he'd been waiting for an audience. I'll bet anyone here $100 that Nurse Hayes quits within a week, he announced, his smile sharp as a scalpel. Some people just can't handle real hospital pressure. The residents exchanged glances. No one laughed. Natalie carried her tray past his table without breaking stride, her eyes fixed on the corridor beyond. Her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, yogurt, sat balanced on the plastic surface like a small, ordinary world about to end. Then Hargrove's elbow shot out. The movement looked casual, almost accidental. His arm extended as he reached for a napkin, and her tray simply wasn't there anymore. It fell from her hands and hit the tile with a wet, violent sound, soup splashing across the floor in a spreading stain, the sandwich component sliding under chairs, the yogurt container rolling toward the trash bin. The clatter silence surrounding conversations like someone had pulled a plug. "Oops," Hargrove said, his tone dripping false concern. "Clumsy, aren't we?" Natalie stood motionless for 3 seconds. That's all it took to measure the room, the residents watching with the careful neutrality of people in survival situations, the cashier looking suddenly very interested in the register, 2 attending physicians staring at their plates with the intensity of men who'd learned not to see things. She knelt to clean. Her movements were methodical, precise. Napkins from her pocket. A wet paper towel from the dispenser. She gathered the scattered food with the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up worse, and she had cleaned up so much worse than this, blood and bone fragments and the anatomical chaos of trauma, but none of that mattered now because this was happening in a hospital cafeteria at 12:16 in the afternoon with witnesses. Hargrove watched her kneel. Then he dropped her patient charts at her feet. The papers fanned across the wet tiles, the edges curling as they absorbed soup. 7 charts, each one containing the clinical history of a patient under her care. Her hands, which had held lives together in field hospitals from Kandahar to Baghdad, moved to gather them. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Staying in your lane is part of staying employed. You're a nurse, not a doctor, and every time you question my protocols in front of staff, you undermine the hierarchy that keeps patients safe." He leaned closer, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, loud, consuming, absolutely certain of its own power. "I saw what you did yesterday with the Morrison patient. Independent clinical decision. No consultation. That's not competence. That's insubordination." Natalie took one measured breath. She rose from her crouch, her back straight, the soiled charts held in her hands like they weighed nothing. A single tear escaped from her left eye, not from fear, not from anger, but from the effort of holding something inside that had been sealed away for 20 years. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they held something that made Hargrove's breath catch in his chest, something he couldn't name and absolutely hated not understanding. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than you in places you couldn't survive," she said quietly. The cafeteria went completely silent. Every fork stopped mid-air. Every conversation collapsed into nothing. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscles working. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Natalie was already walking away, leaving wet footprints across the tile floor. That afternoon, Hargrove cornered her at the medication cart in the ICU. 2 nurses worked nearby, reorganizing supply bins with suspicious urgency. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "You think you're special? You're a trauma nurse with a mediocre resume and an attitude problem. I've ended careers for less than what you just did in that cafeteria." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm watching you now, Nurse Hayes. Every chart, every decision, every breath. One mistake, and I mean one, and you're done. Finished. Nobody in North Carolina is going to hire you after I'm finished making calls." The threat hung between them like contaminated air. Natalie said nothing. She simply continued counting medications, her hand steady, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But inside, something shifted. She'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of being unremarkable, of existing in a world that didn't know her real name. She'd thought she could keep doing that forever. She'd thought she could be just a nurse, just another face in the rotating shifts of Mercy General, just another woman in scrubs pushing medication carts through fluorescent corridors. Dr. Hargrove had other plans. The next morning, Hargrove began his real campaign. Strategy. Not the crude bullying of the cafeteria, but the sophisticated, institutional kind of destruction that came from someone who understood how systems worked and how to weaponize them. He called board member Patricia Walcott, who owed him a significant debt. He'd covered up her son's DUI accident in the emergency room 5 years ago, kept it off the official reports, made it disappear like it never happened. Walcott answered on the second ring, and Hargrove's voice was smooth as oil. Patricia, we have a staffing issue. Nurse Hayes in trauma. I need you to understand she's becoming a liability. He contacted St. Mary's Hospital in Charleston where Natalie had worked for 3 years before Mercy General. He spoke to the director of nursing, his voice carrying the weight of collegial concern. I'm reviewing her file for a possible promotion, and I'm seeing some gaps in her previous employment. Before 2010? Nothing. No hospital records, no clinic work, no facility experience. Then suddenly in 2015 she appears on our roster with a 3-year gap unaccounted for. Federal service, she wrote. Very vague. I'm wondering if you could help clarify. The director of nursing checked her records. Nothing before 2010. Nothing from 2010 to 2012. Nothing from 2012 to 2015. Just those 3 years at St. Mary's starting in 2015, and Natalie's own notation of prior federal service with no elaboration. I'm not finding anything, the director said carefully. Neither am I, Hargrove replied. Which is precisely the problem. He pulled Natalie's personnel file from Mercy General's records, a file that had been carefully constructed to show only what needed to be shown. Her nursing license, current and unblemished. Her credentials, perfect. Her 3 years at Mercy General, exemplary. But nothing before. No references from before 2015. No employment history. No military connection. No trace of Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Coast Guard Maritime Security Response Team, because that woman didn't exist in any official capacity anymore. That woman had been erased on purpose, dissolved into the machinery of the federal government and classified operations that existed in the white spaces of official records. Hargrove didn't know that. He only knew that the absence of a past usually meant something was being hidden. And that meant she was vulnerable. That same afternoon, Natalie moved through the ICU with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. She checked on 4 patients, an elderly man recovering from bypass surgery, a woman in septic shock receiving aggressive antibiotics, a teenager who'd survived a car crash with spinal injuries, and Commander James Riley in room 347, the Coast Guard officer who shouldn't exist in her life at all. Riley's post-surgery recovery was proceeding normally. His vitals were stable. His oxygen saturation held steady at 98%. His chest tube, placed during surgery to drain fluid and air from around his heart, was functioning properly. He was exactly where he should be in the recovery timeline. Natalie checked his breath sounds bilaterally, left side clear, right side clear, good air movement throughout. She documented everything in his chart. Everything was fine. But that night, as she finished her shift and clocked out in the break room, something tightened in her chest. She couldn't explain it. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive in Tikrit, in Helmand Province, in FOB Shank during a mortar attack that killed 3 of her team. Her body remembered things her conscious mind had been ordered to forget. She'd pulled Commander James Riley from rubble 20 years ago. She'd breathed air into his dust-filled lungs. She'd carried him 2 miles through dark streets to an extraction point while rifle fire cracked overhead. She'd been told he didn't survive. She'd been told the entire operation had been classified, erased, never happened. She'd been told his name and his file and the memory of that child's face had to be buried so deep it could never surface. And now he was in room 347. Now Hargrove was hunting her. Now everything she'd built to survive, her anonymity, her competence, her careful invisibility, was beginning to crack. She drove home through rain that hammered the windshield like applause. The apartment was dark and cold. She changed out of her scrubs and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing. Tomorrow she would go back to Mercy General. She would continue being Nurse Natalie Hayes, trauma specialist, quiet and competent and absolutely unremarkable. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that within 24 hours, everything buried would surface. That the boy she'd saved would die in front of her while a man she despised told her to stand down. That she would have to choose between her hidden past and her present survival. That she would have to stop being invisible. But that night, all she could do was sit in the dark apartment and let the rain wash across the windows, and somewhere in the silence of that small, anonymous room, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one piece of proof that she'd ever been anything other than what the world could see, seemed to pulse like a buried heartbeat, reminding her that some things, no matter how deep you bury them, eventually find their way back to the surface. The morning light bled through the hospital window in thin grey stripes, and Natalie moved through room 347 like she had moved through 1,000 other rooms, checking lines, monitoring the ventilator's steady wheeze, reading the vital signs the way some people read newspapers. Commander Riley was 24 hours post-op from an emergency thoracic repair, stable according to the charts, sleeping the medicated sleep of someone whose body was still processing trauma. She'd positioned herself at the foot of his bed to run the routine post-surgery assessment, the kind of check that happened thousands of times a day in hospitals across the country, the kind that was supposed to be routine. It never was. Not really. Not if you were paying attention. His breathing was too shallow. She noted it first, the subtle absence of air moving the way it should, the chest wall rising and falling with the asymmetry of a tilted scale. She moved her hand to his ribs and felt it immediately, the way the right side seemed to lag behind the left, as if the air filling his chest cavity wasn't distributing evenly. Her fingers traced the intercostal spaces, reading the ribs like braille, and the message they sent made her go very still. She looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation had drifted from 94 to 88. The number was falling with methodical precision, like a countdown. Tension pneumothorax. The words arrived in her mind not as a diagnosis but as a physiological fact. Air had accumulated in the pleural space during surgery, and the pressure was building with every breath he took. His own respiration was becoming his executioner. She could see it now in his face, the early signs of hypoxia, the slight dusky tinge returning to his lips even as the monitor climbed higher with each passing second. 79%. 76%. His body was burning oxygen it didn't have. At this rate, his blood pressure would follow within minutes. Cardiac arrest within 5. She reached for the call button, her movement still deliberate, still controlled. Muscle memory and years of protocol told her to follow the chain of command, to alert the attending physician, to wait for authorization. But her hands already knew what her mind was confirming: there wasn't time for chains. There wasn't time for committees. She pushed the call button anyway, because procedure mattered even when it couldn't save him. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway for minutes later, his presence carrying the weight of his title and his certainty. He took in the room with the quick scan of someone who'd trained himself to see only what confirmed his authority. "What's the problem, nurse?" His voice had that particular texture it always did when he spoke to her, the careful pronunciation of her job title instead of her name, the slight stress on the word that made it sound like an accusation. "Tension pneumothorax," Natalie said. Her voice didn't waver. She pointed to the monitor, to the oxygen saturation that now read 71%, to the trachea that was beginning to shift toward the left, to the chest wall asymmetry that would be visible to anyone trained to see it. "Right side. He needs immediate needle decompression." "We'll wait for the attending," Hargrove said. It wasn't a discussion. It was a directive, the kind that came wrapped in the absolute certainty of institutional hierarchy. "The surgeon is doing rounds. We page him, we wait for orders. That's the protocol." Natalie's hands moved toward the crash cart anyway. 68%. The number on the monitor seemed to be falling faster now, Or maybe that was just how time compressed when death was in the room with you, when you could feel it like a pressure change in the air. She had a 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand because she'd already made a decision that her conscious mind was still pretending hadn't been made. With respect, doctor, he's decompensating. We don't have time. I said we wait. Hargrove's voice shifted into something harder, something edged with the kind of anger that came from being challenged. He moved toward her, his hand reaching for her wrist. Step back from that patient. The room held its breath. There were two residents watching from the doorway, a respiratory therapist standing frozen at the ventilator, and Natalie standing between a man whose oxygen saturation was now at 65% and the institutional force that wanted to protect its own authority more than it wanted to protect his life. She didn't step back. She twisted her wrist in a motion that was older than her nursing license, older than her scrubs, muscle memory from a time when her training had involved boarding hostile vessels and securing combatants with joint lock techniques that made grown men gasp. Hargrove's grip broke. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching his wrist. She didn't wait for him to recover. She placed her hand on Commander Riley's chest and located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that had been burned into her nervous system 2 decades ago in places where the stakes had been measured in minutes and blood loss and where the children would live to see another sunrise. The needle went in without hesitation, through skin, through muscle, through the pleura. The hiss came immediately, that unmistakable sound of pressurized air escaping, the sound of a life being returned to equilibrium. It was the sound of relief made audible. Color flooded back into Riley's face like someone had turned up the brightness on a photograph. His chest wall normalized, the asymmetry resolving as the air pressure equalized. The monitor climbed, 78, 84, 89, 92, 95. His breathing deepened. The cadence of his oxygen saturation steadied like a ship finding its keel after a storm. She withdrew the needle and applied an occlusive dressing with the precision of someone who had done this enough times that her hands knew the procedure better than her conscious mind did. Tension pneumothorax resolved, she said quietly. She was already charting the intervention, her documentation precise and clinical, each word placed like a brick in a wall. Patient requires chest tube placement and surgical consultation for possible additional intervention. She didn't look at Hargrove. She didn't need to. She could feel his presence behind her like heat off asphalt, and she could feel his rage like a pressure in the room. His face had gone from red to purple, the kind of purple that suggested all the blood in his body had pooled in his head. "You just assaulted me," he said. His voice shook. Not with fear. With something worse. With the sound of a man watching his authority disintegrate in real time. "You just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on my patient." "Your patient." Natalie finished her charting and set the tablet down. She turned to face him, and when she did, her eyes had the absolute flatness of someone who had already made peace with consequences. His Coast Guard. His under surgical care. And he was in cardiac arrest in progress. The protocol you're citing doesn't apply when the patient is actively dying, and you know it. Security. Hargrove's voice cracked like a bell struck too hard. Security, now. The two residents in the doorway didn't move. The respiratory therapist focused very carefully on the ventilator settings. But somewhere in the hospital, a call had been made, and Natalie understood with absolute clarity that she had just made a choice that was going to fragment her life into before and after. She thought about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of proof that she'd ever been anything other than what everyone in this room could see. She thought about the 8-year-old boy who had recognized her in the hallway years ago and called her the angel of Tikrit in a voice full of tears and gratitude. She thought about the fact that she had spent 20 years erasing herself so thoroughly that she'd almost believed it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she would have made the same choice again, and she knew it. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Hargrove had already activated every institutional advantage he possessed. He'd called Patricia Walcott on the board, the woman who owed him a favor from when he'd written the letter of recommendation that helped her nephew get into medical school. "We have a liability crisis," he told her, his voice steady now, recovered into the smooth tones of someone who'd learned to weaponize institutional procedure. "A nurse performed an unauthorized surgical procedure and assaulted me when I tried to stop her. We need to move quickly on termination before this becomes a legal issue." He'd called Thomas Chen, reminding him casually that Hargrove controlled the peer review committee that would determine whether Chen's research grant application moved forward. He'd brought in Linda Vasquez, the compliance officer, showing her the documentation of the needle decompression, his photographed wrist with finger marks that he'd pressed against his skin hard enough to bruise just before the photo was taken. He'd placed a call to St. Mary's Hospital in Charleston, speaking to their HR department. "I need everything you have on Natalie Hayes. Personnel files, disciplinary records, any gaps in her employment. This is urgent." Natalie sat in the security office on the 3rd floor and watched as her access badge was deactivated by a guard whose name she'd never learned. She watched as they handed her a cardboard box containing the contents of her locker, scrubs she'd kept for backup, a photo of a coastline taken from a military transport plane, a half-empty bottle of lavender hand cream, the few personal items she'd allowed herself in 3 years of deliberately remaining invisible. 2 security officers escorted her down the service elevator, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this was how it ended. Not with recognition. Not with truth. With a cardboard box and a walk across the parking lot in the cold Raleigh afternoon, while everything she'd rebuilt crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. The pneumatic hiss of the ER doors closing behind her was the last sound Natalie heard from inside Mercy General. Within the hour, before her locker had even been emptied, Dr. Hargrove sat in his office with his door locked and his phone pressed to his ear, his voice moving with the precision of a man who knew exactly which strings to pull. "Frank, it's Victor. Yes, from the conference in Phoenix. Listen, I need to discuss a staffing matter at Mercy General." He paused, letting silence work for him. "There's a nurse who's become a liability. Competence issues. Patient safety concerns. I'm not going to involve HR with the details, but I wanted you to hear it from me first since you sit on our board." Another pause. "No, nothing criminal. Just someone who doesn't understand hierarchy. Who thinks she can make clinical decisions without physician oversight." He smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I'd appreciate if you and Mitchell were aware before this escalates. These things have a way of becoming public." By the time he hung up with Frank, he was already dialing his second call. Mitchell answered on the 3rd ring. The conversation was shorter this time. Hargrove had refined his pitch. Liability. Protocol violations. A nurse who'd performed an invasive procedure without authorization. He didn't mention that the procedure had saved a man's life. He didn't need to. What he needed was for the board members to understand that Natalie Hayes was a problem that needed solving. The 3rd call came from Hargrove's office to the administrative office across the hospital corridor. He summoned Linda Vasquez, the compliance officer, with the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Within 15 minutes, Vasquez sat across from him with her laptop open, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. "I need documentation," Hargrove said, sliding a printed incident report across his desk. "Everything on this nurse. Previous employers, background checks, any disciplinary action. And I need a formal record that she performed a needle decompression without direct physician authorization or standing orders." Vasquez's expression didn't change. She'd worked compliance for 11 years and understood institutional politics like a chess player understands the board. "Do you want me to contact her previous hospital?" "Immediately," Hargrove said. "Tell them we're conducting a routine background verification. Ask about her competency, her judgment, any concerns they had about her work. Make it sound administrative." By 2:41 p.m., Vasquez had made the call to Natalie's previous employer in Charlotte. She didn't identify herself as compliance, she said she was from HR at a new facility where the candidate was applying. The charge nurse supervisor at Charlotte Memorial didn't hesitate. Excellent clinical skills, but she had some interpersonal issues. Kept questioning protocols. Rubbed some physicians the wrong way. Never caused a patient incident, but there was friction. Friction. That was all Hargrove needed. He had Frank and Mitchell in his pocket, a compliance officer documenting an unauthorized invasive procedure, and now a previous employer's tepid recommendation that could be interpreted as concern about judgment. The narrative was building like a controlled collapse. At 3:15 p.m., Hargrove walked into the HR conference room where Natalie sat with her hands folded on the table. She'd been told to come here after her shift. She hadn't been told why. The cardboard box was already waiting on the floor beside the door. Linda Vasquez sat across from Natalie, the manila folder spread before her like evidence in a courtroom. Hargrove stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching with the satisfied expression of a man watching his trap spring closed. "Miss Hayes," Vasquez began, her voice the kind of calm that comes from institutional authority rather than kindness, "we've completed our review of the incident in Commander Riley's room this morning. You performed a needle decompression between the second and third intercostal spaces without direct physician authorization. You overrode Dr. Hargrove's explicit order to wait for the attending physician. These are terminable offenses under hospital policy 4.7 and 8.3. Natalie's hands remained flat on the table. The tremor didn't come. The panic didn't come. Instead, something older activated, the same part of her that had made decisions under fire, with lives hanging on the choice. Commander Riley would be dead. That's not your determination to make, Vasquez said, as if Natalie hadn't spoken at all. You're a registered nurse, not a physician. The hierarchy exists for patient safety and institutional liability. When a physician gives you a direct order, you follow it. That's the contract you signed. Hargrove stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. Your previous employer expressed concerns about your judgment. About protocol violations. About resistance to authority. He picked up a sheet from Vasquez's folder. Interpersonal friction with physicians. Questioning established procedures. This is a pattern, Ms. Hayes. Not an isolated incident. Natalie read the words on his face before he spoke them. She'd already known they were coming. The moment she put the needle in, she'd known. She'd made the choice anyway. Ms. Hayes, your employment at Mercy General is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings and then off the premises. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding this investigation. You will not discuss the details of this termination with staff or patients. You understand? She nodded once. Vasquez slid papers across the table. Natalie didn't read them. There was no point. The words were already written. The decision was already made. Security arrived 5 minutes later, 2 men in grey uniforms who treated her like she was a theft risk rather than a woman who'd just lost her job for saving a life. They walked her to her locker on the 3rd floor. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 years stopped what they were doing and watched. No one said anything. No one could. Hargrove had made sure of that. The locker contained the small inventory of a woman who'd learned not to accumulate, a spare pair of scrubs, 3 protein bars she'd been rationing, a photo of her Coast Guard unit from 23 years ago that no one at Mercy General would have recognized even if they'd looked at it. She pulled out her jacket, the grey one she'd worn for 5 years, the one with the faded Maritime Security Response Team patch sewn into the inside lining where no one could see it. That patch was older than the job she'd just lost. Older than the life she'd rebuilt in Raleigh. Older than the version of herself that had learned to be quiet. Everything went into the cardboard box. Her badge clattered against the tile floor as she set it down on the desk. She didn't pick it up. The security guard stood 3 feet away, waiting. Not threatening, exactly. Just present. Just watching. Just making sure she understood that she was being removed. The walk through the corridor felt like moving through water. The automatic doors opened for her without knowing they were closing on her permanently. The parking lot was cold, the kind of North Carolina March afternoon where the sun was bright but offered no warmth. She sat in her car for 43 minutes without turning on the engine, the cardboard box on the passenger seat beside her, before she started driving. 2 days later, Natalie sat in the waiting room of the Raleigh VA hospital, not as a provider, not as someone with credentials or rank or authority, but as a patient. Her appointment was at 10:44 a.m. with Dr. Paulson, psychiatry. Post-traumatic stress evaluation. The intake form had asked about suicidal ideation, about substance use, about sleep patterns. She'd checked the boxes that kept her on the right side of the line between broken and functional. Around her sat veterans she recognized from places and times she couldn't discuss. A Marine sergeant with a prosthetic leg and the particular 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen Fallujah up close. An Army Ranger with a scar that ran from temple to jawline and a left arm that moved like a prosthetic. A Navy corpsman with tremors in both hands and eyes that skipped around the room like he was tracking multiple threats that weren't there anymore. She'd treated all of them. Or people like them. In hospitals with names she wasn't supposed to remember, in countries where the Red Cross on her armband had made her a target and a lifeline all at once. None of them recognized her. Why would they? Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes didn't exist anymore. Hadn't existed for 20 years. In 2003, after Operation Copper Shield in Tikrit had ended, she'd been called into a windowless room at Camp Victory by a man in civilian clothes who carried a briefcase and a security clearance. He'd sat across from her with her file open on the desk and said, "This mission is now classified above top secret. Your service record has been redacted. You were never in Tikrit. Your unit assignments have been deleted from databases. You will receive no medals, no official recognition. You are being reassigned to inactive status and discharged under administrative separation for medical reasons. You will not surface. You will not claim your rank. You will not speak of this operation under any circumstance. If you do, federal prosecutors will investigate you for espionage violations. Do you understand?" She'd understood. Understanding and accepting were different things, but she'd learned the difference long ago. The discharge had been processed quietly. Her decoration sealed. Her performance reviews classified. 23 years of service collapsed into a single line on a public record: administrative separation, medical. The faded patch in her jacket lining was the only proof she'd ever been anything but a nurse. She pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders now, feeling the rough fabric, the familiar weight of the one thing they couldn't redact. The waiting room was quiet except for the fluorescent hum overhead and the occasional movement of other bodies in other chairs. A television played morning news, something about a successful surgery at Mercy General, something about a Coast Guard commander's remarkable recovery. She didn't watch it. She didn't need to. She already knew how that story ended. Natalie Hayes? A nurse called her name from the doorway. The same tone, the same neutral efficiency that Natalie had used 10,000 times with patients of her own. Natalie stood and followed her down the hallway, the cardboard box left on the chair behind her. All of it left behind. The rank she couldn't claim, the medal she couldn't wear, the version of herself that had learned to be invisible so thoroughly that even when she saved a life, all anyone saw was a nurse who'd overstepped. The psychiatrist's office was on the 4th floor. As she rode the elevator up, surrounded by veterans and families and people who needed help, Natalie wondered if this was what the next chapter looked like. Waiting rooms instead of trauma bays. Evaluation forms instead of combat medical protocols. A woman who'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from rubble in a country that officially never happened, now sitting in a chair answering questions about why she couldn't seem to move forward anymore. The doors opened on the 4th floor. She stepped out into the hallway, following the nurse, her hand steady, her face composed, her voice ready to give the answers that would keep her on the right side of the line between broken and functional. Behind her, the elevator doors closed with a pneumatic hiss that sounded exactly like the doors at Mercy General closing behind her 3 days ago. Like every door closing on every version of herself she'd ever tried to be. The hallway at Mercy General on that Tuesday morning smelled like floor wax and antiseptic and something else, the electric charge of a story about to break open. Natalie had just finished documenting Commander Riley's post-op status when the translator found her near the medical records station, a man whose name she'd learned in a different language in a different country, now speaking English in the corridor with his voice trembling like hands holding water. He dropped to his knees. Actually fell, his weight hitting the tile with a sound like a rifle round striking concrete. 3 nurses froze. A resident stepped back. The translator's hands reached toward her, not grabbing, never grabbing, just reaching the way drowning people reach for shore. Angel of Tikrit. His voice broke on the second word. I thought you were dead. The story said you died in the collapse. Fatima, my sister, she said. An American woman pulled her from the rubble and then disappeared like he couldn't finish. His shoulders shook. Around them, staff members exchanged confused glances. A hospital administrator appeared at the corridor's far end, phone already in hand. Natalie didn't speak. That was the thing nobody understood about trauma. It taught you that silence could hold more weight than words. She extended her hand and helped the man to his feet with the kind of steadiness that came from having held people together while their bodies came apart. His eye searched her face like he was reading a name on a memorial. You saved me. The translator gripped her wrist. And my sister. And my mother. The boy, Commander Riley, he was 8 years old. My nephew. She's here? The angel is here. He turned to the gathered staff, his voice rising. This woman. This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. She pulled American soldiers from burning buildings in Tikrit. She ran medical teams that nobody was supposed to know existed. She saved my family. The corridor went quiet. Not hospital quiet, not the controlled hum of ventilators and monitor beeps. Dead quiet. The kind of silence that precedes everything changing. A reporter appeared in the entrance, then another, phones already recording. The hospital administrator was speaking urgently into her device. Within seconds, what had been a private hallway transformed into something approaching a crime scene, but instead of violation, it was revelation. Natalie's composure held. Her breathing stayed level. Her eyes remained clear. But inside, something that had been sealed for 20 years began to crack. The conference room doors opened and Commander James Riley walked through in his service dress uniform, ribbons across his chest like a timeline of survival. He'd been released from Mercy General 3 days earlier, the needle decompression having saved his life while Dr. Hargrove screamed orders that nobody followed. Now he moved toward the center of the room with the purpose of a man who'd made a decision and was committing to it absolutely. Board members sat at a polished mahogany table arranged in a V-shape, the kind of corporate geometry designed to make individuals feel small. Dr. Hargrove stood at the far end of the conference room, his arms crossed, his face the color of someone who'd just understood that the ground beneath him was crumbling. He'd spent the last 72 hours making phone calls, activating favors, constructing a narrative where Natalie's actions constituted assault and insubordination, where her unauthorized procedure, the one that had kept him alive, became the reason she deserved termination. But he hadn't anticipated this. Cameras. Reporters. A uniformed officer in dress blues with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect rather than demanding it. Riley's voice was steady, which was worse for Hargrove than any anger could have been. That woman is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes, United States Coast Guard. She saved my life 72 hours ago when she made a decision a chief of surgery told her was wrong. She was correct. I was in tension pneumothorax. My oxygen saturation was below 70%. She performed emergency needle decompression between my second and third ribs, mid-clavicular line, and released approximately 900 milliliters of air that was compressing my right lung and preventing adequate ventilation. The attending physician would have taken for additional minutes to arrive. I would not have survived for additional minutes. He paused. The room didn't breathe. Board members exchanged glances, real panic, the kind that precedes career-ending decisions. Dr. Hargrove ordered her to wait, Riley continued. She disobeyed him and saved my life. And then he retaliated by terminating her employment and labeling her a threat to hospital protocol. His jaw tightened. That's not protocol. That's obstruction of emergency medical care. Natalie stood motionless, watching the room recalibrate. The translator remained beside her, one hand still on her arm like she might disappear if he released his grip. Reporters called questions. Camera flashes created a strobe effect that reminded her of dust explosions in building collapses, light and chaos, then nothing. Then light again. A woman in a Coast Guard dress uniform approached, a legal officer with captain's insignia and a folder that looked impossibly thin for the weight it carried. She handed the folder to Natalie without ceremony, the way you hand over the evidence that will change everything. Inside, Operation Copper Shield, declassified as of this morning, 0600 hours, by order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 20 years of burial instructions dissolved in black ink and redacted lines. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Marie Hayes. Service dates 2003 to 2023. Theater assignments: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Medal citations: the 8-year-old child listed by name, Rashid Ul-Tikrit, with a note that he'd been successfully placed in a foster family in Virginia and later enlisted in the Coast Guard Reserve at age 21. The room began to spin, or maybe the room stayed still and Natalie was the one dissolving. She kept her hand steady. She kept her breathing level. The mask held because the mask had always held, and that was the entire point. Then a man in dress blue stepped forward, his ribbons so extensive they covered both sides of his chest, his bearing the kind of thing you earned in places that didn't exist on any map. Master Chief Keller. She recognized him not from faces, they were older now, softer in places, harder in others, but from muscle memory. From the sound of his voice giving orders in a language that was half English and half something else, the communication system of operators who'd bled together. 2 Navy crosses. His voice carried through the conference room like artillery. She earned 2 Navy crosses. Silver Star. For Purple Hearts. She ran trauma response for Joint Special Operations across 3 theaters while Dr. Hargrove was finishing his residency. He turned to face the board members directly. She made life-or-death decisions in places where a wrong choice meant your entire team died. She did it without consulting anybody because in the field, there's no time for hospital politics and chain-of-command theater. And when a patient came across her in a hospital where she was being deliberately disrespected, her muscle memory took over. She saved his life. Hargrove tried to stand. This doesn't change the fact that she violated hospital protocol and assaulted. The main entrance doors opened with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested military precision. A Coast Guard Rear Admiral in dress blues walked through, 2 JAG officers flanking him like sentinels. The crowd parted. His ribbons told a narrative of command authority and service that made Hargrove's credentials look like participation trophies. Rear Admiral Michael Thornton, Coast Guard Special Operations Command, he said, and his voice was the opposite of Hargrove's rage, controlled, lethal, the way a blade cuts not through force but through sharpness. Dr. Hargrove, I'm here regarding your interference with a decorated combat veteran's medical judgment and your creation of a hostile work environment for a service member operating under classified orders. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating in air. You contacted St. Jude Memorial, Johns Hopkins, and Duke University Medical Center demanding investigations into Senior Chief Hayes' service record, the Admiral continued, pulling printed emails from his uniform jacket. You leveraged board connections to terminate her employment for saving a patient's life using combat trauma protocols she perfected under fire. You publicly humiliated her, destroyed her property, and physically restrained her from performing life-saving medical care by refusing to allow her access to emergency equipment. The room had become a courtroom. The Admiral was prosecution and judge and executioner combined. The Coast Guard has reviewed this matter thoroughly. Dr. Hargrove, you are terminated effective immediately for knowingly interfering with the medical judgment of a decorated combat veteran and for creating a hostile work environment. Security will escort you out. Cameras exploded with flash and sound. Reporters shouted questions that echoed in the conference room like artillery fire. Board member Patricia Walcott stepped forward, her face the color of hospital walls, demanding, Admiral, with respect, the board has authority over hospital personnel decisions. Ms. Walcott, one of the JAG officers said quietly, producing another folder. We're aware Dr. Hargrove contacted you regarding a cover-up of your son's DUI accident in this facility's ER 6 months ago. We'd be happy to discuss that with the district attorney. Walcott stepped back. The room swallowed her. Security guards approached, the same ones who'd escorted Natalie out with her belongings in a cardboard box, and without any physical contact, made it clear that departure was no longer optional. Hargrove cycled through red, white, purple, the colors of a dying thing. You can't do this. I've been chief of surgery for 8 years. I have contracts. I have 30 minutes to clear your office, the admiral said flatly. Your medical license is under review by the State Board for interference with emergency medical care. The Coast Guard is filing formal complaints with the AMA and the Joint Commission. Master Chief Keller stepped close, his voice dropping so only Hargrove could hear it, though somehow everyone in the room understood the message anyway. Walk away while you still can. Document. Because every operator Senior Chief Hayes ever saved is making phone calls right now. Your reputation won't survive the week. Hargrove was escorted out through the same corridor, past the same nurses' station where Natalie had worked for 3 years being deliberately unremarkable. Out the same doors. His cardboard box was somehow smaller than hers had been. The translator was still holding her arm. Commander Riley had moved to stand beside her, not touching, just present. The Admiral turned and offered a salute, fist to chest, the way Coast Guard operators salute, and Natalie returned it without thinking. 20 years of instinct. 20 years of being invisible. 20 years of muscle memory waiting for permission to surface. 6 months later, Natalie stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes wearing her Coast Guard dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The service ribbons and medals covered her chest like punctuation marks on a sentence that had taken 2 decades to finish reading. Her Maritime Security Response Team insignia gleamed under the fluorescent lights, official now, authorized, real. The faded unit patch from her jacket lining, the one she'd kept sewn inside for 20 years as the only proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes had ever existed, had been replaced with the gleaming insignia earned in rubble and dust and silence. Commander James Riley stood beside her in his own dress uniform, his chest tube scar hidden beneath ribbons. The ceremony was small but attended by the operators she'd saved, the teams she'd supported, the children pulled from burning buildings who'd grown into warriors and translators and Coast Guard officers. Master Chief Keller stood in the front row, retired now but present, his eyes wet with something that wasn't quite tears but close enough. The Secretary of Homeland Security pinned the Coast Guard medal to her uniform, the citation reading her name aloud for the first time in decades, Natalie Marie Hayes, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Coast Guard. At the reception afterward, a young lieutenant approached nervously. Senior Chief, I'm starting trauma training next month. Any advice? Natalie smiled, touching the medal on her chest, thinking of a cafeteria floor and scattered charts and the moment she'd chosen to be seen. Trust your training. Trust your instincts. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Someone asked what happened to Dr. Hargrove. The answer came quiet and without satisfaction, teaching CPR certification courses at a community college for minimum wage, his medical license suspended pending review, his name now a cautionary tale in hospital administrator conferences across 3 states. But Natalie didn't think about him much anymore. She was training the next generation of Coast Guard medics, teaching them the protocols she'd written in blood and dust, showing them that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together. She kept the old jacket with the faded patch in her office, a reminder of the years she'd spent invisible, and the moment she'd chosen to be seen. If you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had to make a choice between following orders and doing what's right, I want to hear your story. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you in the next one.